Hello everybody, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Today our presentation is about how to hack humans, or how to use decision science to build a killer app. See, originally this was an internal presentation for CB Insights engineers, and one of my coworkers said if you're going to have a title like how to hack humans, you have to have an obligatory evil laugh. So this is my obligatory evil laugh. Hope you're happy. About me, a little bit about me. So this is what I look like. I have a human form. If you ever meet me, that's Sean right there. I'm a full stack software engineer currently here at CB Insights. Before becoming a software engineer, I did some research in psychology and behavioral economics, and there I got really interested in it. And now I combine my work as a software engineer and my academic interest in psychology and behavioral economics into basically a very long-lasting interest in human-computer interaction. So I'm very interested in how our application design, how the way that our computers are structured and interact with us influence the way that we experience the computer world and how we behave as a result. If you have any questions or comments or any suggestions or complaints, please direct them to shanlunwang@gmail.com, or you can hit me up on GitHub, github.com/shanlun. I know they got rid of the private messaging options, but you can still contact me there if you prefer. So the motivation for today's presentation, we often pretend that humans are rational creatures. We think that when we make decisions, we gather all the information that we have, and all of our preferences are available to us, and we make a rational decision. But we're not. We know this from a lot of research from Dan Kahneman, Amos Tversky, Richard Thaler, and Dan Ariely, and many others who have done a lot of research, many very brilliant people, and many others like this guy, me. So that's actually me from the comparative psychology lab at Whitman College, where I did my first psychology experiments. We did research into how pigeons and humans make probabilistic decisions differently, and we compared their decision-making strategies and learning strategies to see how our psychology is wired differently. And it was a very interesting study. It's published in Science and Behavior. I recommend that you check it out. So today we'll be exploring some specific topics. We'll be looking at what decision science tells us about human rationality and how to apply that science to build a better application. We'll be applying this mostly to CB Insights platform because, like I said earlier, this started out as an internal presentation to CB Insights engineers. So the subtopics we'll be exploring today are loss aversion, default bias, and anchoring and adjustment. And we'll go into each one of those individually as we hit those sections. So there's so much more, but we don't have the time for this presentation. If you want part 2, be sure to hit me up or let me know, and I will be sure to send out a notification when I do part 2. So without further ado, let's dive right into loss aversion. One of the best illustrations of loss aversion is actually from Joe, a Family Guy. So there's one scene where he's looking at his gun, he says, "This is my gun, there are many other like it, but this one is mine." And that statement, I think, is very telling. He's saying that he acknowledges there are a lot of guns out there that are exactly the same as his gun, but the fact that this gun is his makes him value it more. So that's essentially loss aversion in a nutshell, in the way that we're going to be exploring it today. We don't like to lose things that we already have, or we value things that we have more than the things we don't have, even if they're the same thing. Family Guy is a great example in Joe's gun that we went over. We can also see this in experiments. So Richard Thaler did a very interesting experiment. I think it was actually Amos Tversky who did this experiment. College freshmen, they join a college, they come to the campus, and they hopefully have everything they need, but sometimes they'll miss 1 or 2 household items, things like mugs. And so Amos Tversky did this study where, Richard Thaler did this study where he auctioned off mugs to college freshmen. So he said, "Here's a mug, it's good quality, you can drink coffee out of it. I'd like to auction it off to you." And people would start bidding it up. And usually you end up with a price like $3 to $5, sometimes just a few dollars. That's how much people are willing to pay for a generic mug. But he then went to a different class and did one thing differently. He put the mugs on people's desks and said, "Hey, this mug is yours, it's a gift from me to you, and now I'd like to buy this mug back from you." And it turns out when people perceive the mug is already theirs, they value it more, and to buy it back, people came up with prices that are much higher, things like $7, $8, sometimes up to $10. People were much more likely to come up with a higher price when they perceived that they already have the money. So this shows that people do value things more, even whether it's a mug, it's a gun, or something else. So how can we apply this to the real world? Well, a couple of interesting ones. Do car dealership experiment. Dan Ariely took the research and he went around to car dealerships and he asked the car dealership if they had a loyalty program. So here's a punch card, get 10 oil changes, get one on us. He asked the car dealerships to do something differently. So some car dealerships, he asked them to give out a punch card with 8 punches on them, starting from 0. People have to get 8 punch card, right? 8 punches, 8 oil changes, get 1 for free. Other car dealerships, he asked them to give out a punch card that had 10 punches, and 2 of them already punched as a freebie. So in both cases, it should be exactly the same. You have to get 8 oil changes, and you get 1 for free. But it turns out, people who got the punch card that was 10 and had 2 freebies in it, they were much more likely to come back, much more likely to get that free oil change. So why is that? The hypothesis is that people who perceive that they already have those 2 freebies, they perceive those freebies as much more valuable. So they don't want to lose that freebie. They think that they want to go back and they want to maximize what they got. And so they were much more likely to go back and finish out the punch card. How can we apply this application design? We can do something very similar to the car dealership punch cards there. If we have a progress bar, we should never start at 0. We should get them to do something and then bring people's attention to the progress bar when they've already made progress. We shouldn't, if we want them to fill out a long, say, a profile page, and we have 3 different pages, right, 3 different forms, we shouldn't start at form 0. We shouldn't start at page 1. We should get them to fill out their name, fill out their emails, and then start the progress bar already 20% in, already 10% in, so people are more likely to finish out their form and not lose the progress that they currently have. The second thing we want to talk about is default bias. We can actually see this illustrated in something like Mint, which is now part of Intuit. Essentially, a default bias is very simple. We tend to stick with defaults. Right, Richard Thaler noticed this in 401ks. So he noticed that people don't tend to save enough for their retirement in 401ks. They usually stick with the lowest option in terms of how much they want to contribute. And people tend to misallocate their funds. They tend to put too much of their 401k savings into money market accounts, cash accounts that don't return a whole lot, instead of a mix of stock and bonds that are a little bit more prone to fluctuation, but tends to give you a much better return on the long run. So he wondered why that is, and he asked some companies to simply change their defaults. He asked these companies to get people to contribute more to their 401k as a default, and got people to, as a default, put their money into a mix of stock and bonds like a target date fund instead of money market. And it turns out that very simple thing got people to contribute a lot more, got people to contribute and invest in much better long-term investment vehicles rather than just cash. So it turns out defaults have a very powerful influence on the way we make decisions. We can also see this in cooperation experiments where, let's say it's a tragedy of the common experiment, you contribute some of your money to a pot, the pot grows by a certain amount and it gets distributed among participants. There's always a incentive to defect, incentive to not put a lot of money into the public pot, because if you put a lot in, it grows, sure, but if you don't put anything in, other people put money in, it grows, and you can profit off of basically their contribution. It turns out if you make cooperation the default, people will start defecting at some point, but people are much more likely to start off by cooperating. And so you can stave off even a powerful incentive like the tragedy of the commons or prisoner's dilemma by changing the default option. So default has very powerful influence on our decision-making process. How can we apply this to the real world? Well, a good example, like we already went over, is Mint, personal finance apps. A lot of personal finance apps will say whenever you get paid on a regular schedule, it puts some of the money into a saving account. So by default, you're already moving money into saving accounts, you're saving money by default. And it turns out when that is made, people tend to just save more. When it's the default option, it's the path of least resistance, people tend to follow that option. And we can make it so that that is the good option for them. Applying this application design on CB Insights, we should make the most profitable decision, the default decision. right? So if we want people to sign up for newsletters as part of their platform trial, we should make it so that that box is already checked when they see that pop-up. It should never be an opt-in, it should be an opt-out. If we have things like additional features that we can have them enable, we should always make that an opt-out instead of an opt-in. So that way people are much more likely to sign up and use more additional features and find our platform more valuable. If we have things like sharing collections, collections is an application that CB Insights has that lets you take a lot of companies in our platform, investors in our platform, make it into what we call a collection or a grouping that you can discuss, you can share news articles, we call it the CRM for innovation because it really is, it shows you the most innovative companies, what investors are doing, and lets you discuss it right there. So you can share those collections with other people, and when you share that, we should make it so that the default option is to share with as many people as you can on your team. And that way, more collections will be shared, there'll be more discussion on our platform, instead of making people opt in and say who they want to share with, because chances are it'll get shared with less people. When I was given this presentation within CB Insights, somebody also mentioned presumed consent laws in Europe versus the United States. Organ donation in Europe is an opt-out system, in the US is an opt-in. And it turns out that very simple decision, a simple default, makes it so that Europe's organ donation rates is much, much higher than the United States. So very powerful influences there. So finally, that also brings us to anchoring adjustment. This is a little bit of a big topic, so we have several slides on this, but I promise it'll be very interesting. The good illustration of anchoring adjustment can actually be seen in tulips. Yes, tulips. So what is anchoring adjustment? It's that we tend to make value judgments based on an anchor and then adjust. What does that mean? Well, let's illustrate this with an experiment that happened in, I believe, Dan Ariely's classroom at MIT. Same thing, college freshmen, they tend to arrive at campus, don't have everything they need, and they need to buy them. Might as well be from a college professor that's doing experiments on them, right? So Dan Ariely did this thing where he was auctioning off various things like keyboards, headphones, things like that. And it turns out, if he goes to one classroom and says, hey, who would like to buy this headphone for $100? Then there's no takers, and then he starts the auction and say, how much are you willing to pay for it? Then he goes to another classroom that says, hey, who would like to buy this headphone for $15? The exact same headphone, and he does an auction for it. The class that got the high initial offer, the $100 offer, tend to arrive at a much higher price for that headphone than the class that got the $15 initial offer. So that's what it means. People tend to anchor themselves on a number that's high or low and then adjust based on that. And usually you don't adjust enough to arrive at the true value of whatever is being offered. We can also see this in tulip auctions. So in the turn of the 19th century, when European countries were just beginning to harbor the seeds of their mercantile ambitions, were trading a lot with their neighboring countries elsewhere, and there was this huge bubble where the Dutch tulips were being bid up to astronomical prices. Now, I looked up some of the prices. Dutch tulips are absolutely amazing, they're very beautiful, but I wouldn't pay that much for the tulip bulbs. Well, why did that happen? Why were people bidding tulip bulbs so high? Well, it turns out some historians think that it has to do with the way the auctions took place. When we think about auctions, auctions usually start from a low price, and then it gets slowly bid up over a long period of time. When you're shipping tulips, you can't really afford that. The trains run on a specific schedule, the ships leave harbor on a specific time, and if you're talking about tulips, freshness is very important. You need to get the auctions on right away so that they can go on the right shipping containers. So usually they didn't have a bid up system, they had a bid down system. You'd start at a very high price, no takers, and then you slowly adjust the prices down until somebody goes, I'll take it, and that person basically gets the deal. There's no long process of one over another, I'll bid somebody else. And you can see right there that if we are prone to anchoring adjustment, that auction system will create basically a bubble. It creates a system where people end up overvaluing the tulip bulbs, and it just takes a couple of auctions before people start perceiving the tulips as something that is very, very highly priced. And that basically got out of hand, and the tulip bulbs got bid up to thousands of times of what they're worth today. So some simple real-world applications, we can of course apply this to sales, especially where valuation is nebulous. So things like tulips, for instance, can't really come up with a good valuation for tulips. Some of them are very beautiful. It feels like you would pay a lot for them. You don't really know how much you're going to pay. Things like art is another good example. We know that some art is just intrinsically beautiful and very valuable. And then there are some art where you're not really sure how much you're willing to pay for them. And in auctions where you're anchored to a high price, you're much more likely to pay a higher price than if you were to, say, go to another auction like a yard sale where the anchor price is much, much lower. And then CB Insights, of course, we're involved in the startup world. So I kind of mentioned this. Startups, Uber, for instance, gets bid up to very, very high prices. And, especially some of these companies don't make money. They're actively losing an absurd amount of money, and yet their valuation is astronomically high. Why is that? Well, their previous valuations, if it's high enough, somebody has an up round, right? That ends up increasing the perceived valuation of that company, and it ends up getting bid higher and higher by different investors. But how does this help our application design? There's nothing really here that seems like would apply to application design in general, CB Insights platform specifically. So let's dig a little deeper into this bias, anchoring, and adjustment. We can actually see a good illustration of this, our deep digging in something that has to do with economists. But first, let's go back and look at the theory of anchoring and adjustment. Why do we have this problem? Is it because we defer to authority? Is the fact that we're offered a headphone for $100, do we think that that implies something about the quality of the headphone? Is it laziness? Is it something about our decision making? We don't like to make those decisions and we just decide to take the first offer that comes along? Or is it some kind of decision-making bug, something fundamental about the way that we make decisions? Well, turns out research points number 3. So there were a lot of research that they conducted to try to figure out which one this was. And they disproved the difference of authority in a classroom experiment. So what Dan Ariely did was he went and did another follow-up study with his students. And instead of offering the headphones straight up for $100 or $13 or $15, he asked people to write down the last 3 digits of their social security number and use that as the baseline offer. And it turns out students whose last 3 digits of social security number was something like 999 were much more likely to come at a higher price, offer a higher price for the headphone than students whose social security number ended in something like 001. So last 3 digits of social security number has nothing to do with the actual price or the or the quality of the headphone, but people were still influenced by it. So it doesn't look like it's just deference to authority. And is it laziness? Well, it turns out it's not laziness either. People aren't trying to get out of making decisions. They did this study where participants were doing some puzzles or were paid a certain amount, and they were asked if they wanted to donate some of their earnings to charity. And participants who were anchored to a higher price during the experiment, a higher number during the experiments, were much more likely to donate a higher amount than participants who were anchored to a lower amount. So it's not laziness. They're actively making that decision about how much to donate. They're not really taking the first offer. So it doesn't seem like laziness either. And so that brings us to the decision-making bug. It seems like a decision-making bug. Seems like we want to actually make relative decisions. We want to make decision 1 versus decision 2 kind of call. We don't really want to make sliding scale calls of how much am I willing to pay for this, how much do I want to donate to charity. So a good example is actually, that brings us back to The Economist, is the Economist experiment. So Dan Ariely consulted with economists to come up with a good pricing model. And for a while, he posted the pricing model of $59 for the online only, $129 for print only, and $129 for print and web. You might notice something weird with this pricing scheme. There is practically no reason for people to get $129 for print-only edition. Why don't you just take the web edition for free? And that's exactly what a lot of people did. So why was this important? Well, it turns out if people aren't presented with that crappy $129 for print-only edition, people were much more likely to take the web-only option. But once they were presented with $129 for print or $129 for print and web, people were much more likely to opt for the $129 option. So what this tells us is that people like to zero in on 1 or 2 decision branches that are familiar to them, that are familiar to each other, and make relative decisions based on those. People want to say, for $129, I'd rather have web and print. I don't want to just have web. And people tend to coalesce around that and ignore the other decision points because of those 2 decisions being similar. Sean actually had a little mad scientist experiment. I like to call this mad scientist experiment. It makes it sound much more exciting to the observer. It's a follow-up study to something that Dan Ariely did, where we paid people to either drink a 1-to-1 mix of lime, Gatorade, and vinegar, or listen to a very loud, high-pitched sound for 30 seconds. And it turns out, yeah, we can anchor people left and right. We can say, how much are you willing to, how much do you need to be paid to take this shot of Gatorade and vinegar? And you can anchor people to a high price or a low price, anywhere between our sliding scale. But if you anchored people to anchored people to a high price for, say, taking the shot, and a lower price for listening to sound, and ask people to make a binary choice between, do you want to take the shot or do you want to listen to sound? People weren't actually influenced by the anchor and adjustment, which would be kind of strange because you can influence people when it's on a sliding scale, but when it's one versus another, people were much more likely to make a good decision or a rational decision. So what that suggests is that we're very bad at making absolute sliding scale decisions, but very good at making decisions between 1 and 2. We have a lot of experience doing it, and our brain's wired to make those kinds of decisions. So how does this apply to our application? So what you just saw pop up there is a screenshot of the CB Insights collections application that we talked about earlier. If we want to incentivize a specific action, you can create choices that are similar, and people will zero in on those choices, right? So the collections example here is, suppose we have a download to Excel function. We make it so that the data and the discussion and the comments and everything in collections can be downloaded to Excel, and people can do analysis on them. But we don't want them to necessarily leave the platform. We want them to stay on the platform, right? We want people to stay in collections. We can create 2 different ways to do it in collections, and 1 way to do it to download to Excel. And what that does is, unless people absolutely needed to download this to Excel, people would most likely zero in on the 2 ways to do it in collections, and they'll make a binary choice between the 2 collections methods, and we'll be much more likely to get users to stay in collections and use collections instead of downloading to Excel and doing it the old way. This disincentivizes people from going out of collections. Can you edit the timing of this at all? Or?
What do you mean?
Oh, because I said this, and then I said this, but then I didn't pop this up quickly enough.
Possibly, yeah.
Yeah, all right. Well, why don't I just redo this subsection, and then you can cut it in. So suppose we had a download to Excel function. People could download their data, their discussions, their likes and everything from collections to Excel and perform analysis on it. But we want people to stay in collections. We want people to stay engaged in collections, keep comments, analysis in collections so that they can come back to it and everything's there in one place. How do we do that? So we can create 2 different ways to do it in collections and 1 way to do it in Excel. And unless people absolutely have to download it to Excel, most likely people will zero in on the 2 ways to do it in collections and make binary decision between those, instead of trying to figure out if they're onto Excel or collections or one of those. So essentially it's a way of disincentivizing people from going out of collections and incentivizing them to stay in collections. So in conclusion, we find that our design decisions can materially influence user behavior and user experience. We can apply science. To build better apps, and specifically decision science to build apps that influence user behavior and increase our bottom line. And I hope you stay tuned for part 2. I hope you liked it enough to ask for part 2. And if I do a part 2, I will be sure to share with you.